Viktor Andreyevich was in his late 50s, and he perceived the world as a grand, poorly edited manuscript. He had worked his entire life as a proofreader for a major publishing house, and this professional deformation had permeated his worldview, becoming his sole philosophy. For him, there was no beauty or ugliness, good or evil, only order and error. A speck of dust on the flawless surface of a polished table, an asymmetrical fold in a curtain, the faint creak of parquet flooring. All were typos in the text of existence, which his mind registered with excruciating, unbearable precision. His apartment was a sterile paradise, a space meticulously measured to the millimeter, where every object knew its single, correct place. But beyond its confines, entropy raged, a chaos of sounds, the sloppiness of human movements, the unpredictability of weather. It was torture. One evening, his peace was disturbed, not by thunder from the street or a neighbor's quarrel, but by a quiet yet unceasing dissonance in the geometry of his living room. One of the old parquet boards, which had lain still for decades, had warped by a fraction of a millimeter. An ordinary person would not have noticed the flaw, but for Viktor, it was an ugly syntactic error, glaring in its impropriety. He tried to fix it. He pressed, tapped, even attempted to pry it open and relay it, but the defect remained. Exhausted, he sat in an armchair opposite. He didn't just look at the board. He contemplated it. All his will, all the hatred for imperfection accumulated over 60 years, focused on that tiny point of global disorder. He didn't wish, he demanded. He didn't ask, he prescribed. Inside his skull, pressure built, cold and dense, like mercury filling voids. And in that absolute silence, he heard a dry, barely audible click. Before his eyes, the wood fibers slowly, unnaturally, smoothly flowed, changing their structure, and the defiant board perfectly settled into place, merging with the rest of the floor into a monolithic pattern. Viktor Andreyevich did not flinch. He was not surprised. He felt only a deep, icy sense of correctness, as if a long-forgotten bodily function had finally activated. He didn't ask, how? The question was, why not sooner? That evening, the old proofreader realized that he had been proofreading the wrong text his entire life. And now, an ideal red pencil had appeared in his hands. His first act of editing was the bookshelf. Dozens of volumes collected over a lifetime stood in uneven rows. Somewhere a spine protruded by a millimeter, somewhere a corner was dinged, somewhere the cover paper was wavy from old dampness. Viktor Andreyevich did not touch them. He simply looked, and his will, no longer blind and furious but sharp and instrumental, passed over them like a surgeon's laser. Spines aligned into a single, flawless line. Corners regained their pristine sharpness. The yellowed pages inside the covers silently smoothed out, compressed, as if the book had just come off the printing press. He shifted his gaze to an old cup with a barely visible crack near the handle, and the porcelain fused, leaving behind only perfect glaze. He looked at the wallpaper, whose pattern never quite met at the seam of two panels, and the design flowed, reconfigured, merging into a single, continuous repeat. This was not creation. This was cleansing, the annihilation of errors. With each corrected flaw, the world around him became quieter, more sterile, more correct. The agonizing tension in which he had lived for 60 years dissipated. In its place came not jubilation, but a deep, almost physiological satisfaction, similar to that experienced by someone who has quenched an unbearable thirst. In a few hours, his apartment transformed from a sanctuary into a standard, into an absolute mathematically precise norm. But perfect order brought no peace. It only sharpened his vision. Now, from his flawless world, Viktor Andreyevich looked out the window and saw universal sloppiness in its pristine form. A bent antenna on the neighboring roof, a weed pushing through a crack in the asphalt, a crookedly parked car disrupting the symmetry of the courtyard. He raised his hand, pointing his finger like a stylus. The antenna straightened, the asphalt sealed, engulfing the weed. The car, with a faint scrape, shifted half a meter, parking perfectly parallel to the curb. He was no longer a passive sufferer. He had become the editor of reality, and the entire world beyond his window was merely a draft, awaiting his final, merciless proofreading. His first truly major project was sound. The perfect silence of his apartment, now not just the absence of noise but a self-contained, dense substance, was breached. From the window opposite, on the 4th floor, came the sound of a violin. It wasn't music. It was sonic grime, atonal torture for his heightened perception. False notes scraped the air like nails on glass. Rhythmic arrhythmia twitched in convulsions. The trembling, uncertain vibrato was like a death rattle. This was the most glaring flaw he had corrected so far. A flaw that couldn't simply be moved or straightened. It had to be rewritten from scratch. Viktor Andreyevich did not close the window. He listened intently, dissecting the sound stream into its constituent errors. His consciousness, cold and sharp as a scalpel, targeted the source of the dissonance. The invisible musician, their fingers, the bow, the very soul of the instrument. He did not desire silence. He demanded harmony. Perfect, mathematically flawless harmony. Under the pressure of his silent will, the chaotic passages began to align. The piercing falseness gave way to a crystal clear, yet deathly precise tone. The ragged rhythm froze into a flawless metronomic grid. The uncertain vibrato transformed into a precisely calibrated sine wave, devoid of the slightest human tremor. The melody, a few moments ago alive in its imperfection, full of struggle and hope, turned into a sterile sequence of notes, as if generated by a soulless mechanism. It became perfect, and utterly dead. After a few more bars of lifeless precision, the violin choked on a half note. It fell silent. In the ensuing quiet, Viktor Andreyevich felt something new. It wasn't just satisfaction from an eliminated error. It was a feeling of power over the very essence of creative impulse. There, in the apartment across the way, a person invisible to him had just lost something more than a melody. Their fingers felt alien, the bow became too heavy, and the very source of music within them dried up, poisoned by the injection of an alien, flawless will. Viktor Andreyevich lowered his gaze to his hands. He realized that until this moment, he had merely been warming up, adjusting margins and cleaning up footnotes. The real work was not in correcting the inanimate world. The greatest error, the main syntactic mistake of the universe, that was the unpredictability of a living soul, its right to error, its chaotic, messy search for beauty. And he, Viktor Andreyevich, was not created to correct crooked lines. He was created to edit people. The first human manuscript to land on his invisible editorial desk was his downstairs neighbor, Klavdia Petrovna. She was a walking collection of stylistic errors. Her life was written with a trembling hand. Hurried, rambling speech, full of unnecessary interjections and repetitions, an eternally seeking sympathy, anxious gaze, an old woman's tremor in her hands that turned any mundane task into an agonizing struggle with entropy. Every time he met her at the entrance, Viktor Andreyevich felt an almost physical pain, as if reading a paragraph set in 10 different, incompatible fonts. She was not just imperfect, she was sloppy, and that demanded immediate proofreading. He ambushed her in the stairwell as she, breathing heavily, climbed to her second floor with a string bag in which potatoes rolled, disturbing the fragile balance. She stopped to catch her breath, and their eyes met. Viktor Andreyevich did not greet her. He began to edit. His will, no longer like a scalpel or a pencil, but like powerful, silent software code, entered her, finding and rewriting the root files of her personality. He did not erase her memories. He removed the emotional noise from them. He did not heal her body. He corrected the incorrect signals of her nervous system. Anxiety, that eternal background hum of her existence, was filtered out like low-frequency interference. The tremor in her hands, stabilized like camera shake in a video editor. Her rambling speech, formatted according to a strict template of logic and conciseness. Klavdia Petrovna froze for a second. Her wrinkled face, etched with the map of 60-plus years of worries and minor anxieties, smoothed out. Not like skin smoothed by a cosmetologist's injection, but like a crumpled sheet of paper flattened under a heavy press. The deep, hard-won weariness in her eyes was replaced by a glassy, serene calm. She straightened, her back gaining a posture she hadn't had even in her youth. The tremor in her hands disappeared. She looked at Viktor Andreyevich with a clear, empty gaze and said in a voice devoid of the slightest intonation, "Good day." There was no questioning, no friendliness, no fear in that phrase. It was perfectly reproduced audio information. Then, just as silently, with smooth, precisely calibrated mechanical movements, she ascended the stairs and disappeared behind her door. The next day, Viktor Andreyevich saw her in the courtyard. She sat on a bench, perfectly straight, and stared straight ahead. She wasn't feeding pigeons, wasn't chatting with other old women, wasn't squinting at the sun. She simply was. Her being had become a function, stripped of all variables. She had transformed into a flawless, completed text that no longer needed to be read. It was a fact. Viktor Andreyevich felt a pang of triumph, cold and pure as distilled water. He hadn't killed her. He had finished her. He had brought her to the final period, freeing her from the agonizing process of becoming, from the chaos of emotions, from the sloppiness of life itself. He had granted her perfection, and the price, her soul, her personality, her right to tears, and an irrational smile seemed to him a trivial cost for the order established. He realized that humanity was just a grand, error-ridden draft, and he had a lot of work ahead of him. His work was done. He didn't know how long it had taken, days, months, or a single moment of absolute volitional concentration. Time itself was one of those sloppy variables that he had brought to the denominator of stasis. Now there was no hurried ticking of seconds, no lazy flow of hours. There was only now, eternal, perfectly calibrated, frozen in the amber of his will. The world had become the final, print-ready layout. Everything that had previously caused him agonizing rejection had been corrected. The wind no longer dared to ruffle the leaves on the trees in a chaotic, arrhythmic dance. Now they were frozen at the single, correct, symmetrical angle. Clouds, those messy blotches against the blue, had been dispersed, leaving behind a perfectly even, monochrome dome of sky. Humanity, that multi-volume novel full of stylistic blunders and plot holes, had been edited into a concise, exhaustive summary. People moved along calibrated trajectories, their speech refined to functional data exchange. Laughter and tears, those ugly spasms that distorted the symmetry of faces, disappeared. Love, that chaotic chemical reaction with unpredictable results, disappeared. He had not destroyed them. He had brought them to their final, consistent form. He stood in the center of his creation, at the epicenter of absolute order, and waited. He waited for the final chord of satisfaction, that same icy feeling of correctness he had experienced when he straightened the first parquet board. But it did not come. On the contrary, in this sterile silence, where there was not a single error for his mind to target, he felt for the first time in his life a deafening emptiness. His gift, his essence, his sole function, to find and correct errors, had become useless. He was a perfect key to a lock he himself had destroyed. The hunger for imperfection that had nourished him for 60 years was replaced by satiety, a nauseating fullness in which there was no room for action. A world devoid of flaws was also devoid of content. It was a perfect text that was impossible to read because there was nothing for the eye to latch onto. It was a smooth, endless, mirrored surface, reflecting only his own uselessness. He, Viktor Andreyevich, the great editor, had made the ultimate mistake. In pursuit of perfect details, he had overlooked the overall composition. He had created a world in which there was no place for an editor. He was a god whose creation was perfect and did not need him. His triumph was absolute. And in this absolute, he first realized the nature of true horror. Not chaos, not disorder, but perfection. Infinite, static, meaningless perfection in which he was forever trapped, like the only living cell in a salt crystal. But in this absolute geometry, there was one flaw. Not an internal one, not left by oversight, but an external, fundamental one. He felt it as the subtlest vibration, as an arrhythmia in the very heart of his stasis. It was the ocean. Its perfect, glass-like frozen waters suddenly rippled lightly at the shoreline. First, a barely noticeable movement, then a brazen, rhythmic tide leaving dirty, uneven foam on the impeccable, smoothed sand. It was a rhythmic breach of the silence agreement, a nagging reminder that not all variables had been accounted for. Viktor Andreyevich looked up and saw the cause, the moon. It hung in the black, sterile sky not as a harmonious element of the system, but as an ugly scar on the velvet of the cosmos. Its cratered surface was the apotheosis of sloppiness, its dull, borrowed light, an optical error, and its gravity, that invisible, insolent force, pulled at the watery flesh of his perfect world, making it move, breathe, live its own chaotic life. It was the main, unproofread chapter in his ideal manuscript. He felt no anger, only a cold, absolute necessity. This was the last correction, the final flourish of the red pencil that would bring the universe to its ultimate, consistent form. His will, no longer an instrument, but the very essence of creation, concentrated into a single vector, aimed at this cosmic flaw. A will capable of rewriting a genome and stopping the rotation of tectonic plates, surged towards it, to smooth the pockmarks of craters, to straighten the ellipse of its orbit into a perfect circle, to annul its gravitational influence once and for all. And nothing happened. His omnipotent impulse, before which neither matter nor life could stand, reached the moon and simply vanished. It did not reflect. It was not absorbed. It simply ceased to exist, encountering something so fundamental, so indifferent to his concept of order, that his very power became meaningless. It was like trying to straighten a mathematical constant with ink. The moon continued its journey. And below, on the flawless planet, the slobbery, messy tide continued its work, licking the perfect sand from the shore. He tried again, and again. His will beat against the moon's surface like a drop of water on hot metal, evaporating without a trace. His omnipotence had a limit, and that limit had a name and an address in his perfect sky. He lowered his gaze. His work was not finished. It could not be finished. Never. He was trapped, not in a prison of perfection, as he had thought a moment ago, but in a much more terrifying dungeon, in a nearly perfect world, in a world where absolute order only sharpened, made unbearable, the contemplation of the single, unyielding flaw. His entire being, his whole nature as an editor, was now chained to this one point, to this eternal reminder of his failure, to this asymmetry inscribed into the fabric of existence. He was a god with a single but eternal curse. To see an error he was powerless to correct. He had created the perfect instrument for torture, a world with nothing to see but a single, unfixable defect. And he was the only one who could see it.